I'm Alan Wardus, and this is Think Radio Presents Think Business. My guest today is entrepreneur and business startup cheerleader Delaney Keating.
Is that startup culture is about peer education, and startup culture is about people coming together around lots of causes. And those take shape in the form of companies. And so what we're really doing right now in our early phases is training one another as human beings to be more resilient as we address the challenges ahead.
Welcome to another great conversation on Think Radio.
Think Business is made possible by funding from the ICE Lab at Western, supporting innovative business in the rural Southwest.
If you like Think Business, then I know you'll enjoy the other shows in the Think Radio Presents family of podcasts. Think People, a celebration of just how amazing people can be. Think Planet, conversations with thought leaders on important environmental issues. Subscribe to Think Radio Presents on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever else you get great content. And don't forget to help us spread the word by liking our social media channels and sharing the content we post. We're grateful to have you in the conversation on Think Radio Presents. Keating is the new managing director of Startup Colorado, a nonprofit that exists to support entrepreneurial communities around the state, wherever they are. Keating brings a unique perspective to that mission because, having lived on Colorado's West Slope for 24 years and started her own marketing business in the small cow town of Gunnison, she understands as well as anyone that startups don't just happen in big cities, but in backyards and garages and co-work spaces and barns, absolutely anywhere. And I'm delighted to have Delaney in the studio. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So you're a Colorado girl.
Totally.
Born and
way.
raised? Where'd you come from?
29th and Sheridan, when it was more of a lower class Latino neighborhood.
Aha.
People didn't go to Sloan's Lake when I was a kid. So it's been really fascinating to watch the greater Denver area sort of evolve.
It's hip.
It's way hip. And a lot of that comes out of creativity, I think. Initially, there was a real creative burst in Denver and in Boulder that further evolves into, of course, startups, which we'll talk about today, but other things and just the advancement and evolution of place. Yeah.
Well, because we were talking before the interview today that startups seem to be the new chic. I mean, everybody's an entrepreneur these days. Everybody's got some kind of idea, something that they're working on, something that they're sketching out on the back of a napkin.
Yeah.
I want to start at that sort of high-level question for you of, what's up? Why do you think that is?
Well, I think a couple of things about that. I think really almost in mass, humanity's being driven more to pursue creative outlets and the creative mind, right? So that's a big part of what ignites someone to pursue a startup, right?
Well, that's a big statement, that humanity in mass is being driven to be more creative. Why?
I think there was a bit of a perfect storm. You enter in the new creative medium that came about when the technology sector really started to boom, right? We opened up a whole new medium for creation and exploration. And so that really ignited a whole new industry and culture. And a lot of the startup principles come out of that time. It just really changed. I think at that same sort of time, if we look back at the recession and we even look a little deeper, there was a DIY culture that kind of starts out of the Northwest and trickles down into Austin and across the country. And now really all over the world, there's celebration of not just art and craft DIY, but innovation by necessity, things we see coming out of, the third world, things we see people just developing solutions for.
Well, so out of necessity, that's what a recession sometimes does.
Totally.
Is it sends people by necessity to their garage to try to figure out how to survive it, but also because, as you say, technology has enabled a whole new level of possibility.
Yeah.
Because I think it's been true that people have always sat around and dreamed of things, but now you can actually do them. And so you need something like Startup Colorado then, perhaps, to come along and say, here, let's help. How? What do entrepreneurs that are sitting around in their garage need?
Well, so Startup Colorado, our focus, and Startup Colorado started years ago, and its initial focus was targeted to the Front Range in Colorado. And now this next leg of the work is really specified for rural development, and it's about helping ignite entrepreneurial activity in rural communities. I'm careful when we use the word to say sort of ignite, because I want to be careful that we're not ever talking about something that didn't exist prior. Because the entrepreneurial mindset and innovations have been in rural communities forever by nature of, humanity's involvement and creation of place, right? So humans are involved, these things are happening. It's more about really sort of continuing to foster that so it can kind of level up as our communities really seek to diversify their economies. For me, there's something really important in the story in how we propagate or perpetuate, I guess is the word I'm looking for, the rural identity from inside a rural place, and how we perpetuate that identity from perspective and reflection of that rural place from the outside. So something I think about a lot is how do we turn the rural struggle story, which is generally what's in the media and generally believed inside the rural community and outside the rural community, that these are hard places to make a living.
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough. You got to have 8 jobs.
Yes.
All of that mythology.
The point of origin for the side hustle, no doubt. But, if we look at what's happening, there's a lot of idle, someone said it this week and I thought it was brilliant. Instead of thinking of it as dormant innovation, there's like idle innovation and possibility. And what rural has lacked that has been sort of a challenge where we look at sort of the boom in startup culture in major metros is really a breadth of density of experts and conversation and sort of how the, collective energy of humanity will sort of level up thinking about things.
In a city, you're talking about.
Yeah, that happens there, and that's missing in rural places. And then also access to capital and different types of capital to get those innovations through different levels into development is really scalable companies. I'm also very careful about that word because I think a lot of our rural companies are building for place. And I think we think of scaling in a very sort of quote-unquote unicorn company sort of fashion.
Well, yeah.
And lots of things are scalable. It's to what extent?
And not everyone wants a gigantic business.
Yeah.
Some people want to serve their community.
Right.
And what's wrong with that, right?
And a depth and breadth of really interesting companies that are, 5, 10, 15, 30 employees that are motivated by passion and driven by purpose, I think are really important for community.
Well, and the numbers support the idea that those size companies really are a backbone of the national economy.
Yeah.
I mean, people doing those things where they are is not negligible at all.
Yeah.
Where do you think the perception came from that, in spite of the fact that people are doing business in rural places, where did the perception come from that, no, you have to be in a city? How did we get there?
I think we'd probably, you see success happen faster and at a different pace. You could argue that you see demise happen faster and at a different pace, right? There's just a different pace. And humanity is moving at a different pace. So there's those pieces. If we really look at what's happening in rural areas too, is we have to kind of change the way we think about business, and we can't also imprint that pace that we see growth of companies in urban areas and expect that pace in a rural area. So classically, people say, an early stage company is anywhere from 0 to 5 years. And there's some great metrics about what happens in those first 5 years. I would say in rural areas, you can extend that anywhere from 7 to 10 years. And when you look at a company's sort of first stage of development, what's incredibly fascinating, and we're finding in some of our early work in Colorado, is the extent to which there is research in development into some of these idle innovations. I've come across a couple recently that I can't talk about in depth, but that are pieces of ag tech that have anywhere from 8 to 16 years of research and development into them. And show incredible market potential.
Wow.
Yeah, so I think there's some really powerful things. And I think rural, where a lot of people are driven to support rural right now. There's a lot of foundations. There's a lot of money and investment becoming interested in rural lending agencies, venture funds, foundations, because there's an incredible opportunity there because we're seeing one, I think the need to expand into rural areas as a function of economy, but I also think rural areas are becoming very popular in places people want to live.
Well, yes.
Among my many hashtags is hashtag rural is the new urban.
Yeah. And, people living in rural communities are not sure that that's such a great thing exactly, but it is happening.
It is happening.
And the idea is that we're starting to overcome this bias and this perception that nothing interesting is happening in rural areas. Because really what we've lived with for a long time is that the grown-ups all live in the city, and that if you're trying to do a business in a small town, you're really kind of at the kids' table. And maybe we're going to come give you some help, and it's so cute and all of that stuff. But you've made the point that you think we ought to put that behind us because businesses in rural areas actually have things to teach.
Yes, absolutely.
What are some of those things?
So in my work the last several years, of course, doing this work from a remote location in Gunnison, Colorado, when you bring in larger groups that are sort of convening around the country that have to do with conscious capitalism and sort of those triple bottom line principles or, even the rise of the B Corp, which very much has a place as well. But you look at all of those principles and you bring those to a rural community and say, come see these people speak about conscious capitalism. And everyone in the room looks at you and says, we've been doing that for decades. It's who we are. And I think it's just because there's more of a dependence and a real sense of community. And that's what a lot of larger corporations are trying to return to. And so there
so
are
describe
pieces
conscious
like that.
capitalism for people who haven't really heard that phrase. What are you talking about there in practical terms?
Those principles of like people, planet, and profit, and then how you balance those scales so that we're always sort of making our best decisions as a culture and a corporation to really deliver on all three and maintain an ethic and sort of a moral compass around the work that we do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
And so why do you think that comes more naturally to businesses operating in rural areas?
And it's certainly, nothing is 100%, but I think largely it's, the companies, small companies, whether it's a local newspaper or a company, they're very involved. Their employees are their neighbors. Even if they don't agree with each other, they're sponsoring each other's children's sports teams or collegiate sports teams.
Coaching each other's kids.
They care for the environment that they live in. There's just more of a reality around the dependence on both certainly the people, probably not always the place, depending where you are in the country, but that profit is something that you have to extend into the community.
Well, and that you can't get away with sketchy practices for very long because people will punish you for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of interesting work happening across the country this way right now and in pockets around the world where you're seeing organizations like Startup Colorado and foundations want to take those early startup principles that, in my mind, evolve out of the tech sector and start to apply them for community development. And so that's a bit of an evolution that we're having in the industry of startups on the side of supporting entrepreneurial activity. So, and part of it is igniting people's belief that they can do it, igniting the activity and the ideas, getting people sort of rallied around those ideas, getting people excited about connecting around ideas. So it's an interesting sort of intellectual and philosophical pursuit at times, and how people sort of start to congregate whether because they believe in the idea or they knew each other prior to get an idea off the ground. And so you have that sort of initial founding team and some semblance of founders making a run for it and willing to sort of put out a certain level of risk and make themselves vulnerable to the experience that is failure and chasing what it's like to sort of build and accomplish something as a human being.
Well, yeah, in a community where you know people. I mean, some people who have created successful, large businesses, starting in tiny rural communities, have actually challenged this idea that it's easier in a city. They've said, no, it was easier for us because we knew everyone.
Right.
You know, we were supported every step of the way by people who really believed in what we did. That's not that easy to come by in a more populated area. It's easy when you start talking about entrepreneurialism and startups and venture capital and, you know, looking at statistics and so forth, to forget that at the heart of every startup and every new business are people.
Yeah.
And, you know, I had Karen Hoskin in recently, the owner and founder of Montagna Rum Distilleries, and she said the defining characteristic of entrepreneurialism is just being terrified.
Yeah.
All the time. Do you agree with that? That there's a certain amount of terror that goes into this because you are taking that risk. You're putting yourself out there. You're risking your money, your time, your reputation. The question is, do you think that's accurate? And in your job, your role of fostering startups, do you find yourself dealing with people on that human level also, not just with spreadsheets and so forth?
Oh, absolutely. A lot of our work, really. So, you know, at the level in which an organization like Startup Colorado plays, and we'll talk about some of the other sort of methodologies out there. You know, we don't work direct with individual entrepreneurs necessarily. We do, and we connect them to resources. But we're about sort of the community development layer and helping those convening activities and events and sort of, so I look at Startup Colorado as more of a cultural type of movement in terms of what our mission really is. If we look at what is the foundation of an entrepreneur and what does it mean to really take that risk, and I agree, it's not, you know, you have to be motivated, I agree, by that sort of general sense of terror. And I would say it's really that percentage in your personality that's risk averse enough that you're like, okay, I'm going to do this.
Yeah.
I think it's also about people who can't let go of the possibility. And so they see something that's possible.
Gets under their skin.
And they're not afraid to test for it and prove it. And so I think a lot of, when we look at serial entrepreneurs and things like that, it's people who've been unafraid to test something and potentially fail and start over again, sometimes fail multiple times. And it's that testing and exploration. And so part of it is sort of an exploration into, you know, facets of the human mind, what it means to be a creature on this planet, as we try to solve for greater challenges in our future. So I think there's a big part of that it's just, you know, I think why we see a real rise in it in Colorado is it is really in alignment with the roots of the West, right? Like there's still people coming to the West. We're still sort of caught up in this pioneering our future kind of moment. And so that's exciting for people. There's certainly also a class of entrepreneurs who see an opportunity to build something and that it has incredible potential for financial gain, but most of them by nature turn around and build something else and something else. So it doesn't seem as a kind of an art form to just have financial gain at the end of it. It's this kind of constant drive to create. And so that's where I think it falls really closely in line with the roots and creativity. And I think in this rise in entrepreneurial pursuits, we see some people calling themselves entrepreneurs, or you would say, arguably, I think you're creative and maybe you haven't crossed that threshold yet. But how do we get you across that threshold? Because you're obviously driven to create.
Right.
What are the resources we need to get you across that threshold? Because then there's an opportunity not just for that person, but for the people who would be an employee of that company and the community where that company would exist, or how
Sure.
that company could change, the world. At the biggest
Exactly.
level.
In some cases, it really is the products that they're creating, or the processes, or
Yeah.
new ideas, really do come directly to this major societal and environmental challenges that we face.
Yeah.
So fostering that is good for everyone.
Yeah.
It's not just about making another widget.
And we're seeing an evolution in thinking in venture funds and a rise in different types of impact funds and social impact funds, and an incredible breadth of conversation happening that's meant to sort of catalyze and sort of catapult that future for us. I had an interesting moment. Did you want to hear the sad story? It's not a sad story.
Let's
it's
have a
great
sad story. We won't stay there, but
No, it's not a sad story at all, but it's a very sort of raw moment for me last September after doing this work. Like you said, it's humanitarian work. Absolutely. You're
because
working
it's
with people who are putting something on the line.
at their
They're
most
stressed,
vulnerable.
They're scared, they're vulnerable,
yeah.
they're chasing a dream, and you're acting, whether you're acting as a coach or an educator or a mentor, you're really being diligent on their behalf. So it can be very exhausting work. And last September, before I was in this role, even now, I was at Denver Startup Week, and I was suffering fairly severe burnout from my job.
Wait, that happens?
Yes, especially when you're in dealing with startups, which is great. But your commitment is because it's again, well, for me, the commitment is that, sort of a personal mantra for me is that I crush hard on brilliance. And so I'm constantly fed by that proof of the potential of the human being. I mean, and even my best friend will tell you, if she's in a meeting somewhere in her work, she'll send me a text message and be like, there is this geek speaking right now who you would love. Because, yes, I do crush hard on brilliance. And that's just sort of who I am by nature and why I'm driven to the work. It doesn't mean you don't suffer burnout, because you exert a lot of energy, especially, whether you're working with the entrepreneur or from Startup Colorado's perspective, working with the community, we're working with a lot of human dynamics and really sort of, when you're building a movement and sort of rallying people around a cause is no small task. So here I was, moments away from sitting on a panel at Denver Startup Week. And in my head, I'm thinking, I am exhausted. I feel like I have nothing good to say. I don't know what I'm going to say. And I always want to really show up for others, be very present. And in the moments before going on stage, that sort of 5 minutes sitting there, I'm thinking in my head, accelerators, incubators. I'm so tired of those words.
Yeah, who cares?
Entrepreneur. Oh my God, what does that even mean? And then I think, in startups, like, what are we even doing? Like, what is it that we're doing with all of this? Yeah. And so then in my mind, I start playing a little game, and I take the word startup and I start saying it backwards, and I realize that startup backwards is pootrats.
Oh,
and
then. So did you share that with the audience there at...
No, I actually didn't, but it helped me refresh myself, because I was like, well, it's all a bunch of pootrats anyway, so who cares?
That's stuck in my head now. Thank you for that.
Hashtag pootrats.
Yep.
What's great about it is it reminds you to look at things from all angles, right? But then I quickly, as I sat there just sort of shaking through all of these things in my head and letting myself just explore my sort of exhaustion with words and that some of these things that are sort of like trending and in this moment with startup culture, I really somehow created a pathway in my brain to go deep for a second and realize that what I think we're really doing and why humanity is driven to all of this is that startup culture is about peer education, and startup culture is about people coming together around lots of causes. And those take shape in the form of companies. And so what we're really doing right now in our early phases is training one another as human beings to be more resilient as we address the challenges ahead. Because that's what the majority of startup curriculum is about. It's about being nimble, being willing to test and iterate and go forth. And so that's pretty incredible when we think about that, and grateful for that moment because I think I did a pretty good job on the panel. We talked about other things.
Without using the word poutrats.
No, but I'll be bringing it in somewhere.
Yeah, well, you just did. That's going out there. That's in everyone's lexicon now.
Yeah.
When you get to the end of your rope, just remember poutrats.
Poutrats.
Well, I think that's such an interesting idea at this time where we're starting to realize that many of the consequences of pursuing business as usual the way we have for the last century or so aren't all that great. And so it's tempting for some in the activist community, I think, to point fingers and blame business in general. Business is the problem. Capitalism is the problem. But you're suggesting that, nope, the business process, startups can actually be a source of healing, a source of rehabilitation. And that's exactly what's happening.
Yeah.
When somebody comes up with a new, I'm thinking of, Kelly Cox in Delta, a new valve for how an irrigation system can work and saves tons and tons of water. Okay, that's a business.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also really important, could make a huge difference around the world. Do you think it's fair to say that entrepreneurs really are the way forward through these massive challenges that we can agree on we face?
Yeah, I think it's evolving in this moment. Some of the curriculum and approach is constantly evolving because we'll advance it as well. But I think the sort of pursuit of it is humans remembering how to build and evolve sort of moment to moment, and that learning to keep pace with the pace of change. So it's part of our evolution, which is why we're so drawn to it. Will everybody be an entrepreneur? I would argue no, and that's okay.
Sure.
But there's a need for all the people that are part of a startup and are part of building something together. So there's more and more companies that you see with interesting organizational structures and models that really engage their employees and really the human mind to be a part of the constant evolution and change of whatever product or service is being pushed forward into the world. And so it is training everyone to be an entrepreneur enough so that you're a really active part of creating your job and the product or service that you're working, the mission that you're behind, right? Mm-hmm. So if everything has a mission and a purpose, you're a really active part of that. And so I think it does largely tap into sort of that creative mind. There's a fair bit of these principles that kind of come out of creative thinking and design thinking, which is my background. And you watch how that threads in to mesh with these business principles and, whether it's manufacturing, all kinds of different things that it pushes forth and taking something to market. And we see how it's creating and enhancing certainly the human experience, quite often daily, in delivering simplicity, ease, things that solve for time. And then on the flip side of that, and something I think rural can stand to really surprise us with, and I do think we'll continually be surprised by rural, is the level of environmental impact solutions that will come out of rural areas and things like ag tech, things like Kelly Cox, and the water widget, other things of this nature that we've started to see in Colorado. And those are the first entrepreneurs that have reached out to me since I started in this position. They have been people far off the beaten path who've been working on something all on their own. They have patented. They're testing, going to market. And so it really matches. I think a lot of people in rural communities They don't have that. They're willing to take the risk because you've had to make an intentional decision to live in a place already.
Sure.
You took a certain amount of risk in your life by doing that and not going to work for the corporation that gave you the, the retirement fund and probably the health benefits and the other things. So you're a different mindset anyways. And so I'm very excited about learning and understanding how we best support these people and these idle innovations across the state.
Yeah, because ideas happen everywhere.
Yeah, ideas happen everywhere.
I mean, there is no geographic
because
boundary.
humans happen everywhere.
We're everywhere. There's no reason to say that an idea that originates in the tiniest town in Colorado can't be the
a
next
game changer.
great thing.
Yep, absolutely.
We kind of glossed over the idea a moment ago. We brushed past it really fast. That failure is a big part of the entrepreneurial process.
Yeah.
It's just baked in. It's the very, very rarest story where somebody succeeds the first time wildly and off they go. My question for you is, you're an entrepreneur. You've started your own business. Have you ever failed?
Oh, absolutely.
What did that look like?
I think sometimes when your creative mind's success after it's come and gone feels like failure. Like, what do you do when the show is over?
Oh, yeah. Well,
you watch a lot of creatives they get depressed when it's over.
I agree with you.
You're like, what's next? You have to have a kind of a come down and almost a grieving period. And I'm sure there's plenty of really intelligent writing on that very subject because we're pursuing, that sort of state of flow and that high level of activity and engagement. So I think that it's just kind of built in, and then, if we look at true failure, I've never, for whatever reason in my mind, even considered that unless you looked at it from, retrospectively, that I did fail. And it was because I really I guess, be grateful for the fact that I've always just seen moment to moment everything as a learning opportunity. And through different events in my life was really trained to realize that oftentimes your worst day is also your best day. And so I guess it's just sort of having that sort of deeper faith in self and the bigger picture and trust in the process that,
Well, Nelson Mandela is supposed to have said, I never lose.
Right?
I either win or I learn.
Yeah.
And I think that's so important because when something happens to your baby that looks like all is lost, you've lost money, you've lost time, you're back to the drawing board, you got to start over. That can be devastating or incredibly empowering.
Yeah.
And it's just a matter of what you choose.
I think the only place where it gets hard is because no matter what work we're in, we're all working with other human beings. And so once you've sort of built the ship and decided to become a ship captain and headed out to sea, and you've got this company behind you, your commitment to all of those people who have agreed to go on this adventure becomes, I think, the most stressful part for an entrepreneur, for a business owner. And so that's where failure, I think, becomes a bigger risk point. That's where I think things get exciting in terms of how we look at companies and different organizational structures and how employees buy into companies on a deeper level where they're really a part of it. And it probably in some ways helps alleviate that from the entrepreneur because they're all in it together, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the place where I see failure feeling insurmountable. And I never had to experience that. But I know how I feel when I'm in a leading position and
we don't want to disappoint
my
people.
care and attention for my team. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, clearly there are resources available to people wanting to start a business.
Yes.
I mean, on the accounting, legal, marketing, name it. So we don't need to really belabor that point.
Yeah.
But one of the things that often gets left out of that is this idea of emotional support. So as we near the end of our time, what advice would you give to those entrepreneurs that are right now standing at the edge of the cliff, to help them with self-care?
I think often we feel very isolated in the initial pursuit if you're not part of a partnership. And even that can probably feel isolating. The biggest thing is like, dude, you got to ask for help. It's the same thing. It's like, toss up your white flag and get help when you need it, and get it before things feel insurmountable, because there's more support out there than you can imagine. In the state of Colorado alone, community to community, and certainly coming down from our Office of Economic Development, there is more access to resources than we can really keep our finger on. It's really incredible, but it is about asking for help and realizing that you're not alone and that you don't have to be a hero. And so I think that's a big part of it. That's certainly built into the culture and the way that startup culture has evolved, and that there's a big principle inside of it to build mentorship for entrepreneurs so that they have access to mentors, and that it can extend well beyond the sort of mechanics of the business into tending to the spirit of the founder and the business. But it is a very important topic because founder health and mental health has become a real conversation, as we've seen a rise in suicides. And that's that isolation. Isolation's always troublesome for a human being.
And that's why I bring it up, because it is a growing problem.
Yeah.
And if you're standing at the threshold of this, it's something that you need to account for. It's it really should probably be a section of your business plan.
Yes.
How are you going to take care of yourself, and what's your support group? And
totally. Most accelerator programs I know and work closely with right now bring in mindfulness training and different things into their curriculum. There are conversations about how we build support networks for this in the work. And when you're on the ground, that's part of what you're kind of really sensitive to. Not that you're watching for it, but when you see someone in a stress state, you're definitely tracking with them to make sure they're okay and kind of help get them access to the support they need. Yeah.
Well, and I think we learned an important tool today, and that is to just start running words backwards.
It's all pootrats anyways.
It helps. It really helps.
It really does. Well, I don't know. You put poo at the beginning of anything and you got to smile, right? I'm just trying to keep it real out here, Alan.
I think it's been very helpful. Very helpful. Delaney, thanks for coming by today.
Yeah, thank you
Great
so
conversation.
Much. Awesome.
Thanks for watching. Join us next week for another great conversation on Think Radio Presents Think Business.